Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to open this afternoon session with some remarks on Vanbragh's sleeping parlour, which, trust me, won't be as dangerously soporific at this hour as it might sound. To quote from an account of it, "The temple of sleep opens its doors to you a short distance away, as if to draw you from a surfeit of admiration and give you the leisure to regain your strength, so that you may more easily explore the rest of the beauties of this enchanted dwelling. This temple is situated deep within a secluded spot, cultivated with all imaginable artistry, in the midst of a small, dark, and cool wood, far from all noise and breathing, so to speak, only tranquillity." In 1748, an anonymous Frenchman, one J.D.C., visited the gardens at Stowe, and as part of his write-up of that experience, gave us this evocation of one of Vanbragh's more enigmatic buildings, a folly called the Sleeping Parlour, and later known as the Temple of Sleep. Working with the landscape gardener Charles Bridgeman to lay out what was then a relatively unremarkable tract of Buckinghamshire countryside as a cutting-edge landscape conceit, Vanbragh's involvement at Stowe was brief, spanning less than a decade. The birth of these famous gardens came shortly before his death. The instigator was Stowe's Richard Temple, Lord Cobham, an old campaigner and comrade-in-arms of the Duke of Marlborough, and Vanbrugh was engaged to supply Temple with the requisite temples and ornaments to Bridgeman's work. At Stowe, we see Vanbrugh later on in his life practicing in a less restless and more serene idiom, perhaps in some cases, in the classicism of his lake pavilions, the Rotunda, and Temple of Bacchus. These are lovely works, but aren't exactly typical of our subject, I feel, and I think even have a somewhat anonymous quality that perhaps literal translations of one of the earlier talks bears here. They don't seem to bear his unique character, whereas others of them, like the cold bath, the pyramid, and other designs unattributed to him currently, like this Hermitage of 1732, ostensibly by Kent, but very similar to a drawing of Vanbrugh for an unidentified garden building, these bear slightly more hallmarks of our subject's approach. Now, conceived early in the 1720s, or thereabouts, Vanbragh's Temple of Sleep was completed probably by 1726, the year he died, and the building did not long outlive him. By 1763, having existed for about 40 years, it had been demolished as part of the remodelling of the gardens, carried out by Cobham's successor, Earl Temple, who also instructed his architect Borrow to meddle with Vanbragh's lake pavilions and rotunda. Earl Temple, it seems, did not have our reverence for our subject. So, as you can see from this slide, which is a fragment of gouache plaster discovered during the archaeological work and written up in the report on that work, this is an archaeological paper in approach somewhat, reconstructing the temple from the physical and textual fragments of it that have been left behind. We must, using inferences and echoes, try to grasp at what has become, through a dearth of original material, something of a dream narrative, if I may say. Well, why do this? Well, the building repays intention as an enigmatic late work, as I've said, ostensibly drawing upon continental folklore, for reasons I will set out, and formal style in an English landscape setting, all distilled through the unique charcoal of the heart and the mind of our subject. It was also an exceedingly unusual temple type, without any real parallels. More than anything else, it was, I think, quintessentially Vanbrugh, though perhaps not how you might imagine, for reasons that we will come on to. So by the time our anonymous Frenchman J.D.C. visited in 1748, Stowe was famous, its grounds regularly toured, written up and published, and the Temple of Sleep was encountered approximately two-thirds of the way through the circuit of the grounds, an appropriate point for wearying tourists to take their ease. It was in this location here. It lay at the heart of Bridgeman's Sleeping Wood, an area of woodland comprising a series of paths radiating from the temple and linking to an encircling serpentine walk around the edge. Now, whilst the other follies and landscape riffs at Stowe drew upon classical themes and vignettes and other devices, this one very clearly and distinctly drew upon a different tradition, at least ostensibly. Mother Goose, or the continental fairy tale, being inspired by the French authors Charles Perrault, La Belle au Bois dormant, not Sleeping Beauty, as it was often translated, but the beauty in the sleeping wood. I think you'll all be aware of this tale and its moral, that patience is a virtue and true love is worth waiting for. Funnily enough, this rather maps onto Vanbragh's life, marrying as he eventually did when he was 55, but I shall not dwell too much on this, except to quote him writing to Lord Carlisle in 1721, 2 years after the marriage, and finishing a quote incidentally from the first session today. "I have every day of my life, since 20 years old, grown more and more of opinion that the less one has to do with what is called the world, the more quiet of mind, and the more quiet of mind, the more happiness. All other delights are but like debauches in wine, which give 3 days' pain for 3 hours' pleasure. It has, however, been my chance to lead a life quite against my sentiments hitherto." Vanbrugh, of course, was well acquainted with French culture, as we have heard. Of note here, the Labyrinth of Versailles, a hedge maze planted by that same author and translator of the fairy tales, Charles Perrault, between 1672 and 77 incorporating groups of fountains and sculpture depicting Aesop's fables. And we've heard already how Vanbrugh translated Aesop's fables long after he returned from France. And we perhaps might see the maze-like sleeping wood and its temple as faintly redolent of Perrault's labyrinth, a kind of Mother Goose Pie, if I can, of Vanbragh's French influences and experience. But was it quite what it seemed, at least outwardly? So, in The Tale of Sleeping Beauty, the building in which the princess sleeps and everyone sleeps is, of course, a chateau or castle. But with the Temple of Sleep shown here, the best engraving we have of it by George Bickham. In this, our subject veered away from any notion of a castle air in a Palladian direction. It was very nearly a cube in footprint, though not quite, and it was adorned with porticos and steps to the northeast and southwest elevations. You can't see in this drawing a simple cornice trimming the whole. So about 20 years ago, the Sleeping Wood was partially recreated by the National Trust, and as part of this archaeological work, located enough of the foundations to enable its dimensions and construction material to be ascertained and its footprint subsequently marked out. It was not a very big building, that's the first thing, like all temples and follies. 6.3 metres wide across the portico fronts, 6.7 deep. And in this engraving by George Bickham the Younger, we sense something of the mystery of the building. It looms alluringly, even seductively out of the Sleeping Wood. I think there is something rather powerful, actually, about the plain, unrelieved walling and the way this focuses attention on the portico. And note the similarity of these with Vanbragh's earlier lake pavilions at Stowe I showed you on a previous slide, and with the Temple of the Four Winds at Castle Howard, which is one of the next temples he raised to this one. And as Vanbrugh observed of that building, that later building, were there no porticos, the sun would strike in so full as to make it quite disagreeable, whereas these porticos will keep the sun almost always out of it and yet leave it quite light of the most pleasing kind. Our anonymous Frenchman JDC went on to observe that the building is made of hewn stone and comprises only a modest room where comfortable sofas invite you to sleep, and where there are very many pleasant fresco paintings on all the walls. Other visitors describe these frescoes as consisting of medals hanging by festoons with Caesar's heads over them. Not very fairy tale at this point. We have no references to the spindle or the witch of Sleeping Beauty, and it's perhaps a stretch to think of the Caesars as the handsome princes. Caesars, of course, though, were popular motif in art and architecture across Western Europe, but they're not necessarily what you might expect to find in a temple of sleep, unless, of course, they're intended to invoke the sense of power and decadence of those rulers. And perhaps there is indeed an innate decadence in the inscription that was on the temple frieze, which isn't shown in this drawing, but was attested to by visitors. Cum omnia sint incerto fari tibi, or, since all things are uncertain, indulge thyself. Should we consider, then, that there may be something less than innocent, decidedly unfairy-tale-like in the conception and design of this temple? Was the room within intended to serve other purposes? A double room, to borrow from Baudelaire some centuries later. As he wrote, a room that is like a dream, a truly spiritual room, where the stagnant atmosphere is nebulously tinted pink and blue. Here the soul takes a bath of indolence, scented with all the aromatic perfumes of desire and regret. There is something crepuscular, bluish shot through with rose, a voluptuous dream in an eclipse. But the decorative work was not confined to the interior of the building. Oddly, the Bickham engraving plays down quite significantly these, the temple's crowning urns. They are remarkable. There were 4 of them, one upon each corner of the building, and they would stand out in animating its roofline and flagging its dedication, its intended use, its associations, and in giving its soul. As you can see here, they took the form of urns bearing 4 moulded faces, equally spaced on each side, surmounted by twisted finials and balls. Though faces, I think, perhaps isn't quite the right term. Grotesques or gargoyles would probably seem more apt. The Temple of Sleep was crowned with a dozen of these effigies, by turns monstrous, priapic, and grave. I've set out an array of 8 here for closer inspection, and you can make out how there are approximately 3 types: bearded satyrs, horned fawns, and grotesque monsters. Whilst these are relatively predictable things to find in a sylvan setting, what's interesting here, I think, is their variable expressions of delight, lust, rage, sorrow, weariness, and everything in between. Might we take them as personifications of these various shades of the human condition, united under the banner of sleep? When the Temple of Sleep was demolished, the 4 urns were removed to the Oxford Bridge that had been created in the 1760s as part of a new approach to Stowe House. Today they are the substantive remains of the temple, and it is significant, I think, that they did survive. True, they are themselves substantial things. Each one is the height of a person, from base to ball, and each leering face is larger than life-size. But they are also the parts of the building, I think, which most bear Vanbragh's character, his approach. Whilst his designs for the temple are not known to survive, this drawing in the Vanbrugh album of 3 urn sketch designs and the urn designs upon another late folly of his to the left-hand side of the slide are suggestive. Far from mere decorative fancies, these urns were central to the architectural concept of the Temple of Sleep. They hinted at the Furies and the fauna, to which the temple was at least semi-playfully dedicated. They exhibited what the visitor to the temple might be subsequently visited by. Moreover, when considered as part of an overall decorative scheme for the building, with the more dignified and conventional Caesar's heads of the interior, perhaps 12 Caesar's heads within and 12 grotesques without, the building starts to feel less like a fairy tale building and more like a temple, perhaps to the complexity of sleep, and even to the complexity of the human condition, far from the simple moral of a fairy tale. The Echo at King's Weston, which was roughly contemporaneous with the Temple of Sleep, or at circa 1722 by Vanbrugh, probably simultaneously, and this photograph shows how he made use of similar urn designs to express the dedication of the Folly, in this case the Echo, and to lend animation to the roofline, our subject being, of course, a man of restless rooflines. And Bickham's engraving, the one I showed you earlier, rather misleadingly portrays the building as hemmed in by woodland, but with only one principal frontage. But we do know that 6 paths converged upon it, and you can see here a detail from contemporaneous map from all directions, and that it had 2 principal fronts. In other words, this was a building to be appreciated in 3 dimensions, not in 2, and the temple could be seen variously corner on, side on in the oblique, and the role of these urns, as well as serving a symbolic or allegorical purpose, becomes clear as well in 3 dimensions, animating the roofline, providing the building with a picturesque silhouette. Now, contrary to what our visiting J.D.C. thought, the Temple of Sleep was not of hewn stone, as it turns out, but of plastered brickwork walls, incised to resemble ashlar. You can clearly see brick debris in the image of the archaeological work on the left, that is the foundations of the temple, taken from the excavation report. Now, this approach was common enough in approach to the construction of most follies and other garden buildings, most of which were ephemeral projects, not necessarily designed to last. And certainly at Stowe in particular, such buildings were often demolished and recycled into new ones as the landscapes around them evolved. And most follies, of course, are characterized by their practical uselessness and ornamental quintessence. But the matter is more nuanced in the case of the Temple of Sleep, I think. It was one of Stowe's more useful follies in that it was a building that could be used, with its double room and exhortations of indulgence to its visitors. And I think it nicely expresses a paradox, which is at the heart of all follies, namely that behind their outward uselessness there is a deeper mind-opening usefulness in their ability to transport, to evoke, or indeed to inspire. Now, researching a building like this, one looks to parallels, but there are really none with the Temple of Sleep and its dedication. The comparators which do exist are quite wildly divergent in time and space. So on the right, we have the steps to the 4th century Temple of Nodens at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, a Romano-Celtic healing god whose complex included a mysterious, long building adjacent to the temple, which, it is believed, is where the supplicants and sort of poorly people slept and were visited and healed by the god in the night. You can see the long building on the left-hand side of the slide. So when he designed this building, our subject was old and reflective, and as the letters show, had lived a very full life. And it was, I think, an interesting time for him to receive such a commission as this, to be working in partnership with Bridgeman and others. And it seems fitting that the temple existed for barely 40 years. Sleep, after all, is a temporary state. It's a many-layered one, embracing a wide spectrum of mood and feeling. And it is this essential quality which Vanbrugh captured in the Temple of Sleep. Less a fairy tale curio, perhaps, more a temple to the human condition or to its complexity, and maybe even Vanbrugh's more humane building, dare I say. Now, I shall end once again with the inscription, which I'm convinced, by the way, was Vanbrugh's own coinage, and which could be even his surrogate motto: since all things are uncertain, indulge thyself. Thank you.